these people lying down beside their altars, having had lots of wine that they got by oppressing the poor and enjoying the huge feasts and so on. This was the system. Whereas, it's very important to appreciate that biblically, the fellowship meal with the Lord, the sacrifice meal, is always symbolic. Even in Old Testament times, it's essentially symbolic. It's not really there to satisfy your hunger. And Paul makes a real fuss about this, as you know, in 1 Corinthians 11. He says, hey, don't come to take communion hungry. If you're hungry, have it at home. This is not a meal where you stuff yourself. It's a meal that you got to recognize, you discern as a worship of Christ. So even though, yes, it may fulfill your hunger in some way, the basic idea is that is a spiritual enterprise, not just a form of eating. But in idolatry, it's a form of eating. So lots of people would go offer sacrifices every night. No problem. If you had the money, you could do it. It's like having the money to eat out every night. But the best is the sex. I think it was probably for some people. Believe it or not, you actually had a sanctity for promiscuity in polytheistic, pantheistic idolatry. Sex was a part of the process. There are many references to this. We see it in Numbers 25 when the Israelites are at Baal Peor and the Moabites get them involved in sex as part of their worship. The theory was this, that all creation is procreation. Everything that comes into being is born into being. How is it that the gods produce fertility? They produce it by sex in heaven, as it were. So the gods and goddesses are always having sex, and that stimulates nature to have sex. It's why there are references in the law to not sowing your field with two different kinds of seed. What people did was to drop this kind of seed in and that kind of seed in and say, okay, mate, right there in the ground. They would symbolically think of everything being born into existence from mating. And thus, if you went to worship and you wanted to stimulate the gods in heaven to procreate, then what you did was to have sex with a prostitute. Now, women never go to prostitutes, men go to prostitutes. And even homosexual prostitutes were provided. So we see reference in the book of Amos to quote a man and his son sharing the same girl, which is idolatrous practice, sharing the same prostitute. We see reference, especially in 2 Kings 22 and 23, the reforms in the days of Josiah, when he has to drive out the prostitutes from the Asherah sectors of the temple, and also drives out the male homosexual prostitutes from the temple, and so on. So even sexual preferences were accommodated. So here they take something that is in itself a violation, we would say, or anybody with the truth would say, of what righteousness is, and actually build it in as sacred. So full-blown worship involves sex with a prostitute. And this symbolically gets you fertility. As you can understand then, that made idolatry attractive. And generation after generation had a hard time staying away. It was tough not to be attracted by all those conveniences and benefits and so on. And instead to worship an invisible God who insisted on righteousness and keeping his covenant and wouldn't let you fool around and indulge yourself and everything else. It was tough.